Thank you, Peter. I'm just wondering how many of you just whispered to yourselves 23, 24? How many speakers do we have left? I say that in appreciation for the patience that you've shown with us and in recognition of the wisdom that you have as individuals and collectively. I want to say something near the end of my remarks about your collective wisdom and the experience that I think you'll all have together tomorrow. But this really has been an extraordinary day, and I think it's going to be an extraordinary couple of days. I want to congratulate Peter and Gabriel, IPAC and MASS LBP. I don't know where that acronym has come from. Oh, well, there you go. Makes sense. Il fait grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. I've been sitting here for much of the day pondering whether or not there's anything useful for me to say or to add to what's been said already. And so I don't think I've got anything useful to add. I'm just going to introduce those two women that came along a moment ago. No. I don't know where I'm going with the introduction after this, Peter, because I've got someone else to introduce, and we can reverse the order entirely. But actually, I will use my time, and I'm a maritimer. We're going to take every opportunity we have to speak to people from other parts of the country, because we often gripe about not getting a chance to do it often enough. 2 weeks ago, to this day, I was sitting amongst 18,000 people in GM Place in Vancouver with my 13-year-old son, Colin, and attempting at the end of the women's gold medal game to sing "O Canada." And up to that point in my life, I'd never had so much difficulty in my life. I, like so many other people, both there and across the country, were, I think, welling up with tears and choking out the words as best we could. And there's a risk of melodrama when we talk about the experience that Canada has had in the Vancouver Olympics. So forgive me if I appear to you to be a little bit drunk in the anniversary compulsion that was implied in the title of Peter Ackroyd's book, The Anniversary Compulsion. He referenced about 1967, I believe, three fundamental truths: that what's important to a country is storytelling, excellence, and matters of the soul. So my talk with you today will touch on the importance of soulful storytelling and its relationship to this notion of civic engagement that we hear about from time to time. The achievements of our athletes at the Olympics, as incredible as they were mainly just a backdrop in the setting of a context for hearing our stories as Canadians. For example, for those of us Canadians who have members of our families living with profound differences, it seemed quite fitting that the first big story that we heard was the one about Alex Bilodeau and his brother Frédéric. And for those of us Canadians who know the feelings of emptiness, heartache, and possibility that come in the passing of a loved one, could identify deeply with the experience of Joanne Rochette. And we could go on and on about the stories that we heard about John Montgomery, who we could connect with in terms of his earthiness and his candor, Clara Hughes, her humility and her generosity, Moyer and virtue, the innocence and the grace, and the stories of regular people, Canadians all, facing adversity through their entire lives with courage and a spirit that kept weaving together, I think, a bigger story of a country that was richly seeing itself reflected for the first big time. A Canada that was just then touching its own soul. Some say that love happens when souls connect. There's nothing more exhilarating than telling someone you love them and actually hearing the same words and feeling it in return. This experience could not have played out more literally in the hugs, chants, and high fives across the streets of Canada that everyone was experiencing during and especially on the last day of the Olympics. My experience, fortunately for Colin and me, was on Robson Street and Granville Street, and amidst that sea of red, And I've been trying since that time to identify what was it that was magical and special that I was feeling on those days. And so I thought back to the diversity question that Chief Justice McLaughlin spoke about earlier, because the high fives that my 13-year-old was getting when he put up his hand for just 15 seconds and getting 15 high fives were from 80-year-old men with Crosby jerseys on with Chinese descent. Colin followed the conga line of the Indo-Canadian 20-something men who were drumming down Robson Street. But it was the experience of giving high fives to a number of people from the downtown East Side that, for me, told me a story that something really different was happening. Because these are people who in the past I've, in some respects, represented, and who are the most disenfranchised and disconnected people in our communities. Now, the fathers of Confederation might not have imagined a country as diverse as the one that we experienced 2 weeks ago. But we can bet that they envisioned a just, soulful, and loving society. I expect there will be much analysis and writing done about what happened to our country in those days, but I want to share with you a little bit about my experience that day. My experience was one of genuine love, in all its complexity, a love that was revealed in soulful stories. I've been perplexed in all the work situations that I've done over the years that we often speak with our public and professional voices and rarely speak with our personal, soulful, more private voices. This experience for me played out most dramatically when I was leader of the Liberal Party in Nova Scotia, and I was on the floor of the Nova Scotia legislature and frustrated about the direction in which the debate of the day was going, and I laced into my speech a 4-letter word. Now, if it was the F word, I think everyone would have continued with what they had done, but it's a pretty ruckus group. The word I spoke about was love. And the place went silent. And what occurred to me is that this profound word that laces through so much of the values that we have as individuals and collectively we never talk about, and when we say it, we're all stunned by using those words. I think this is in part because our issues are often spoken of from our heads and not sufficiently from our souls, as Peter Ackroyd spoke about earlier. But for all of time, in almost all civilizations, around fires, in circles, and in village squares, people have been gathering to share their ideas on matters not just of the head, but of the soul. Robert Putnam, in his seminal book, Bowling Alone, spoke about the disinclination we have in this modern age to associate with each other. We don't bowl on teams together. We aren't part of church organizations, civic organizations, political organizations the way that we were. And what is the consequence of that is a question that is gnawing at the root of what we talk about in civic engagement. Prior to 1967, I would argue that we often listened to each other's stories quite deeply. And from that period, many of Canada's most important questions and its most important innovations emerged. We were the leaders around issues concerning progressive tax, public health, public education, social safety net. All of these things came about when we were telling each other our stories. When we as a country have been at our best, we've put into practice policies that reflected the basic principle of being our brother's keeper, of loving your neighbor. That's hard to do without a binding identity, a commitment to each other, and that commitment starts with understanding who we are as individuals and as a collection. And in no area is this more important from my perspective than the need to embrace civic engagement in the political arena. So if you're in the political sphere, in the public service, a bureaucrat, I invite you to consider that the myth that elections and only elections give governments mandates to act in whatever fashion they choose needs to be challenged. And though a wide variety of mechanisms exist, we're not employing them sufficiently in Canada. Citizen juries, citizen assemblies, deliberative dialogue, social networks, the new opportunity for us to find ways to connect with each other. And your discussions with each other tomorrow, I think, will profoundly lay the groundwork for what we need to do as a country in 2017 and beyond. When you do that, I invite you to take your personal voice into the public discussion, whether it's tomorrow when you go back to work. For me, that was an experience that I was challenged with when I first got into politics. I had never been involved in politics. First political meeting I ever attended was one to determine whether I should run for the leadership of our party. And so when I showed my experienced team what my speech was to be before all of Nova Scotia on January 14th, 2002, I told them I wanted to say a poem. This experienced team paused and looked at me and said, "We don't do poems in politics." And I dumbed it down a bit, used a few lines, and a number of years later, I had to leave politics. And I look back for a variety of reasons. But when I look back at the successes and failures, and I feel lucky to have had that experience, I think about the things that I enjoyed and the things that I regret. And I'll leave you with this. The thing I regretted most was not speaking with my personal voice on that first day and saying that poem. And the poem goes, "If you always believe what you've always believed, you'll always feel the way you've always felt. If you always feel the way you've always felt, you'll always think the way you've always thought. If you always think the way you've always thought, you'll always do what you've always done. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. If there is no change, there is no change." Thanks very much.